Is it Tainer's too today? Same day, huh? Happy birthday, Josh Tainer. Yep. Yeah, there's kind of a lot of folks brought into this here world on this here day. There's somebody else. I want to say Chris Sockwell's sister, it's her birthday today too. Is that right, Chris? Because if I'm right, dude, and you're just now learning that, that's going to be awkward. But I visited with him today. Huh?
She's not here tonight.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I went out and saw Toby today and her daughter, which would be Chris's sister, and then I guess the granddaughter and another couple, and then eventually Jeanette. I mean, it was a party out there in the middle part. Toby loving the birds and the changing colors of the trees. I think she's got a couple of doctor's appointments tomorrow, and just trying to get to the bottom of some stuff and get her through that. Jeremy and I got by to see Marion Isabel, who will be having pretty extensive back surgery tomorrow. A couple of the L's and one of the S's are getting fused in her back. And, she's, you're going to be a little apprehensive about that when you're going into surgery, but there's also this strong, confident hope that on the other side of this, past recovery, she will be relatively pain-free, because that's all she's known for months on top of months, maybe stretching to years. So we prayed in hopes that that would be obviously successful. Last week, in our study of the wrath of God, we got to this point, and maybe a little beyond it, but I don't want to just jump right in the middle of the Torah. Just take us through these, going down the line here, and I want to kind of impress upon us the little stories and episodes where God's wrath, God's anger is poured out. In a lot of these stories, the word anger or wrath per se is not necessarily used. We'll see it like in Deuteronomy. There's a lengthy passage where basically Moses summarizes all of the times where God got angry with them, and he'll talk about how they provoked him to anger. Obviously, one of the things I want to do after this survey is to step back and ask the question, although it's kind of humorous to put it this way, if I, for whatever dumb reason, wanted to provoke God's wrath, how might I go about doing that? Right? Asking it that way allows us to answer some questions, the big question, where we can kind of boil down some of the areas that are very clear in the first 5 books of the Bible. These are foundational documents for, not just Judaism, but also in many ways Christianity, okay? And so we go, okay, if I wanted to provoke God's wrath for whatever dumb reason, what would I need to do to provoke that wrath? And we're going to have some answers to that. And we'll also look at a few other matters also. But the first task here tonight is to get through this. We've already mentioned that, even again, the word wrath or anger or even jealousy or justice, none of that stuff really appears in Genesis chapter 3. But we would be fools not to think that we're not seeing the holiness, justice, righteousness of God in the book of Genesis in chapter 3 with the expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden. And this would have been God's response to their sin, which that sin, that transgression, And it's interesting, like if we said, what did the sin look like? What did it look like? It looked like a woman taking a bite out of a piece of fruit. Now, in other context, I don't know, maybe some of you are like, well, I took a bite out of a piece of fruit today, I gnawed on an apple, or I cut up an orange, and I had some fruit today, right? So we see that sin is whenever God expects something from us, or He forbids us to do something. Whenever we transgress that and we go against that, that is in fact sin. Okay? That is evil, as it were. Okay? So there are consequences to that. We pointed out those consequences not only were immediate for Adam and Eve, but we've also could highlight that there were these cosmic consequences to Adam and Eve's sin. Probably the most serious is the fact that we're all going to die. Okay? We're all going to die. That is something that death entered the world through that initial sin. Some of the other consequences, ladies, is the fact that childbirth is evidently way more difficult and painful than it would have originally been. Okay? It does, it's kind of like people have wondered, well, if I stubbed my toe in the Garden of Eden, would I have felt pain? I think you would. But others say, well, no, you can't have any pain in the Garden of Eden. Was there work in the Garden of Eden? There was work. It wouldn't have been, the kind of grueling work perhaps and sometimes what we feel like is pointless work as it is today. But there's an increase in that. There's also the toil. The work thing gets just worse for mankind on the other side of the fall. So there's an example, the flood. The flood is a massive, important demonstration of God's wrath against sin and injustice and unrighteousness and wickedness. And we could try to play God and try to think on His level, and there's a lot of people that are willing, as we mentioned, to stand over God and to basically judge God for His actions. I said as just a corrective to that, we need to be more, our default position needs to be standing under God and seeking maybe as best we can to understand His actions, not so much judge His actions as if He is capable of doing wrong, right? See, if you stand over Him, the thought is that you could potentially have the higher moral ground and that you could stand in judgment on God and say, well, if I was God, I would not have done that. And we could say, well, that's kind of what we would expect because you aren't God, right? And your perspective on a lot of things are certainly not to God's level, right? We've already pointed out that our aversion to sin doesn't quite match God's aversion to sin. Because if our aversion to sin matched God's aversion to sin, how much do you think we would sin? It'd be a big fat 0. And so sometimes we find pleasure in sin. Sometimes we think we can find some satisfaction in sin. Sometimes we think that sin isn't as bad or as harmless as it is. Sometimes we often fail to see just how systemic sin can be, the problems that ripple from an individual sin can have profound effects on not just their immediate family like a spouse, but it could have effects on their children, which can have effects on the broader family, which can have effects on a community, which can have effect on just rippling out from that sin. And there's perspectives on this that we just often don't take the time to either think about, or sometimes it just goes unnoticed. We're perhaps oblivious to just how awful the effects of sin can be. Sometimes we get it. Sometimes we're like, if I do this, this is ultimately going to hurt me, and I've wised up enough to know I don't want to go down that path. But God decided that the best thing to do in order to preserve His goal to redeem humanity was to start over with one family. And people might question that, or they might say, well, that seems a little drastic, or did it really take that desperate of a measure? Evidently, it did. And maybe we look at the world today and we think, man, there's some really bad stuff going on out in the world, and there's some really awful things that are happening out there in the world, and I could not disagree with that, but one wonders what we might have seen in the world in the days of Noah. What would that have looked like? How awful had it gotten? The way that it gets described is that every intention of a man's heart, minus evidently Noah and his little family, every intention of his heart was evil. I mean, we have a lot of people whose every intention of their heart's evil, but it's one thing to say we have, millions upon millions of people that do that. It's another thing to say everybody except like 8 people have got this thing going way off in the wrong direction. So, something to consider. Sodom and Gomorrah. Obviously today, the Sodom and Gomorrah discussion these days in our contemporary context here in America often revolves around what really was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah that led to their demise and destruction. And we have scholars, professing scholars claiming that the Sodom and Gomorrah event had nothing at all to do with homosexual behavior. They will say that with a straight face. They will claim that, no, the reason why Sodom and Gomorrah got torched is because the men in that city knew that the men that had come to visit were angels, and they were desirous of being with angels. That's why they got torched on this occasion. I beg to differ, okay? And I'm not saying that homosexuality was the exclusive sin that led to the downfall of Sodom and Gomorrah, but it is ludicrous to try to argue that it wasn't among the issues at play in Sodom and Gomorrah. So we see that happening. We mentioned the death of Ur and Onan. Both of these guys are explicitly said to have done wicked in the eyes of God, and God subsequently and forthrightly dispatched their lives from this planet. Okay? And again, we have to remind ourselves that when we're dealing with God, we are dealing with God who has a right and has the authority to make said decisions. Whether or not we fully understand, whether or not we want to think to ourselves, that seemed a little much, we have to remind ourselves yet again, we don't share God's perspective, we don't share His omniscience, we just don't have that. We go into the book of Exodus, there is the plagues on Egypt. This, of course, is going against a nation that is not His people, so to speak, at this point. But there are escalating judgments against Pharaoh and Egypt that culminate with that one I've got mentioned here, the death of the Egyptian firstborn. It's 20 chapters later, after Israel has in fact received the 10 words or the 10 commandments. And you might recall that the first two of those commandments were really centered on the exclusive honor and worship and glory that is due Yahweh the Lord. And that they are not to bow down to idols. The ladies and I, on Wednesdays over here in the West Wing, and that's a shameless plug for any lady in here that might be available at 10 o'clock on Wednesday mornings. If you want to come over, we're studying the book of Daniel. Do you all remember, right, in Daniel chapter 3, we have these 3 Hebrew boys. Daniel is not in focus in chapter 3. People have questions about that. But there's a focus on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the king makes this law that you have to bow down to this 90-foot golden statue. Okay? A 90-foot golden statue. If you've ever been to the Lincoln Memorial, you know how Lincoln's sitting down in his chair? Okay, you actually have to think about the building that has been raised over Lincoln, and that would be the height of this statue. So it's pretty massive. It's my personal opinion that the statue is supposed to represent Nebuchadnezzar. And I say that because in the previous chapter, it says that Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold in that dream that he had. It's the head of gold. So it's like Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm going to make a head of gold and I'm going to put it on a gold body. And I'm going to set it up in front of everybody. And I'm going to ask everybody to worship this particular idol. And I want you to look at how angry he gets when he finds out that somebody ain't doing it. I really do. It's my conviction that it was a very self-focused, selfish deal here. But here's the thing that we talked about in the ladies' Bible class. If you, upon threat of being tossed in a fiery furnace, right? That, by the way, could get up to probably about 1,500 degrees. And more than likely, the fiery furnace you're going to be thrown into is what they used to smelt the gold that made the idol that has now been repurposed for the destruction of these people who will not bow down to the idol. Okay? So, you tell me if you wouldn't try some of these mental gymnastics. Here's one. Well, I know that in Exodus 20, God said, don't bow down to idols. I know that this idol's nothing, so maybe I can bow down to this idol, but God knows my heart. God knows that in my heart, I am not really giving this idol any play in my life. I know it's just a golden statue. And so, do you realize how we would rationalize this so that we can spare our lives? Well, spare my life, and then I'll be of more use to God alive than I would dead. So, there's the gymnastics that we'll be doing in our brains. And what's interesting to me is that the Hebrew boys, whatever thinking and rationalization they might have done, they finally conclude, we cannot, in good conscience, bow down to this idol, and we're not going to do it. What's fascinating is all throughout the Torah, even like virtually on the heels of receiving a very direct command not to bow down to idols, not to even think about making graven images of anything on the earth. Within a breath, it seems, they are doing just that. And you talk about shaking your fist in the face of God, right? And recalling, too, that the people who are doing this in the golden calf incident are the very people that God rescued from horrific slavery. And then you tell me that He's not supposed to get upset with that. Right? If you're a parent, you've been upset with your kids before, right? Maybe sometimes you get upset with them because they're just, maybe they're just being such ungrateful children, And maybe you get tired of taking them down the toy aisle on a Walmart outing sometime. Just out of the goodness of your heart, you want to give them something because you love them and you want to see them smile, and it's okay. It's okay to dote on them from time to time. There's people that go in a way other extreme on this. But doesn't it kill you, though, when you get home and they're already asking for something else? They're like, what? We just got you something, And then when the complaining and the grumbling and the murmuring starts, it has a way of crawling up somehow up underneath your skin. And we see this playing out. Like in 33 of Exodus, after they have suffered, there's a point where God tells the Levites, I want you to take a sword, and when you go through the camp, from one end of the camp, one gate to the other, I want you to cut down companions, neighbors, and brothers. Just when you're making your way, if a neighbor, a companion, this is in the wake of the golden calf incident, he goes, I want you to slay them where they stand. And they did that. 3,000 men, 3,000 Israelites died as a result of that action. Now they did it in obedience to God. And this became a part of their punishment after the golden calf incident. And then in the end of chapter, or the start of chapter 33, this is where he says that I want you guys to go to the land of Abraham, the land that I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then, you know what he says? He says, but I am not going to go with you. And the reason I am not going to go with you, this is interesting. It's kind of some mercy on God's part in a really interesting way. He goes, the reason I'm not going to go with you is because if I do go with you, I will consume every last one of you. And that kind of reminds you of a consuming fire. What is it that God knows about Himself? And what is it He knows about mankind that He can conclude that there's a very good possibility that if I try to go into this land with you right now, that I might very well take every last one of you out? Right? Because there's this, God is intimately aware of what His holiness and justice demands in the face of rebellion and sin. Now Moses is going to, as he does, he's going to mediate, because here's the thing, Moses is like, hey, if you're wanting us to go into the land without you, no thank you. And you brought us out of and he just starts to remind God, you brought us out of Egypt, and we really want you to go with us into the land of promise. And God is going to relent, which is an interesting dynamic that plays out in the Torah again and again. What about Leviticus? What about the death of Nadab and Abihu? It's not a long section here. It is, it's like, 2 verses, though some people go deeper in the chapter to get at why they think this happened. But it says, now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it, laid incense on it, and offered unauthorized fire, some translations say strange fire, before the Lord, which He had not commanded them. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Question. If you are, let's just bullet, if you are a Levite in Israel, and you have priestly duties that God has laid upon your shoulders, is this event going to affect you at all? Why? I think if you are, I think it would perk you up, sober you up. It would remind you that God is not to be trifled with, and that when God asks something of you, asks something of us, we ought to take it very seriously. And what's so disconcerting today is that there are a lot of people that have got themselves in sort of like a theological quagmire, where they've just about concluded that God doesn't care about obedience anymore. That God doesn't expect us, even though, again, we understand the dynamics of salvation by grace through faith and all of that, there are some people that want to divorce faith from any sort of obedience. And they'll say things like, if you're trying to obey the Lord, you're trying to earn your salvation. No, it might be that I'm trying to obey the Lord because, one, He's God and I'm not. Two, I have a feeling He might know what's best for me. Number three, I ought to respect Him enough for bringing me out of Egypt, right? To actually pay attention to what He says and do what He says. If anything, out of gratefulness, right, and gratitude for what He's done. Not in any way to earn this salvation, because that is frankly impossible. But any theology that says obedience doesn't matter, I don't know. I mean, the God that did this is still the God that reigns from heaven right now. Not that I expect us to get shot down or struck by the fire or lightning of God on the spot, but it ought to be instructive to us to be people who truly care about obeying Him. There's the wrathful warning for disobedience that we'll come back to at the very end if we have time. Look at Numbers. Numbers is loaded with instances of God's wrath being enacted. More times than not, it is because of the grumbling, murmuring, and complaining of the people along the way. More of these than not have to do with that particular issue. So, for instance, there's fire at Taberah. Taberah, by the way, means burning. And we get this fire of God, which might be lightning, okay, comes down and strikes the outskirts of the camp, killing some of the Israelites, which kind of sobers up the rest of the people on this occasion. And with a little bit of intervention or some mediating, this goes by the wayside. This one's an interesting in 11:31 through 35. Not sure you've read this in a while, but one of the things they continued to complain about was their food. And one of the things that particularly that they really didn't, I guess, were missing was that meat back in Egypt. We want some meat. We had potted meat. You know what I think of when I think of potted meat? I think of Spam. Or Vienna sausages, you know? That's not really what their potted meat was. I'm sure it might have been tastier than that. Although I will say I ate ate my weight in Spam in India, and that was just so I could stay alive and not get some horrible disease and die over there. So they wanted this meat. And this is an interesting story, because one of the things we know that God had been providing them with was what? And He was daily providing them with manna. Except for one day. That's why they were to gather a little more on the last day before the Sabbath, right? But He has it so that some quail, i.e. meat, is brought within the vicinity of the Israelites. And they go out there, and all day, all night, all the next day, they are hunting quail. And it depends on how you read this as to whether the quail were flying 3 feet above the ground or whether the quail were so plenteous that they were piled up 3 feet from the ground. Okay? Just a lot of meat. And they get all this meat. It says like the guy that got the lease brought in like 10 homers of quail. And you're like, well, what is that? I'll tell you what it is. It's a lot. Okay? And they get them all in there, and they're spreading it out over camp, and they're having this, basically just this food party. And everybody is just so fired up about all the meat that they have amassed in the camp. And the text says that before they could even eat to digest the meat in their mouth, God struck them all dead. Now here's the part where you go, that's a bit much, God. And I somebody that's of a skeptical bent of mind, or somebody that thinks he has the right to stand over God, right, rather than under God, somebody that's standing over God could look at this story and they can take pot shots at it all day and just try to say, why would you serve a God that would do something like that? But what was God angry about there? There's greed. Maybe more than that. There's seemingly some ingratitude for what God had been providing for them. Maybe even beyond that was a lack of trust that God would continue to provide for them. Look at all this quail, it's like God's like, you start to get this message. Guys, if you will just trust that I am all you need for everything, we'll be good. And we'll be just fine. Right? But along the way, they forget who they have in God and think they got to get this and get that and take this. They complain about this, complain about that. It's not long before the rebellion at Kadesh happens. This happens in no time. This is the whole spies report, and they come back, and there's this faithlessness on it. They're like, we have the God of the universe that's going to go in here and has already promised to help us wipe out everybody in the land of Canaan. And Joshua, he gets it, right? Joshua gets it. Caleb gets it. But the majority of the people don't get it. And God realizes they still don't trust me, right? I've done positive things for them. I've given them some negative things also to think about. And yet they still spurned me. And so he sets out to wipe every last one of them off the face of the earth. And then once again, here comes Moses on bended knee. Please don't do this. I'm as frustrated as you are. Then there's Korah's rebellion. This time it's leadership. This time they're like, God, the leaders you gave us, Moses and Aaron, we don't like them. We'd like somebody else. By the way, do human beings still mistrust leadership. The human beings still get mad at leadership. The human beings, never satisfied with leadership. It doesn't matter what level you're talking about here. We just, we're often assuming the worst, or we're assuming we would do better if we were in their position or something like that. Korah stands up, it's like, I'm your man. I'll be your leader. What does God do in response to that? He opens up the earth. Kind of like splitting these aisles right here. Opens up the earth, and all these people fall in it, and they're done. But he's really not done then, because you'll notice right after that, in the same chapter, he sends a plague out there. Moses knows it's coming. He's going to try to get Aaron out there to kind of head this plague off, but it already started. People are already dying. The waters of Meribah is especially tragic in a way, because this is where you find out, like we should have never, questioned this, but God's anger is impartial. Because on this occasion, he has to tell Moses, and he has to tell Aaron what? You're not coming into the promised land, because you did not obey what I asked you to do. Is God a just God? Is he a merciful God? You're like, yes. That's the thing. That's the question I like to ask about the Torah is, at what point, if you were God, would you have consumed everybody and walked away from them? Right? So there's still mercy and grace in all of this. But man, there's also this exasperating justice and holiness that just keeps coming to the forefront. There's the fiery serpents situation, again prompted by complaining. There's the Baal of Peor incident. This is where they started taking foreign wives. And then those wives are like, hey, come over here and bow down to our idols. So at the end of Numbers, we got people still of the Israelites who are supposed to be worshiping and serving Yahweh alone, who are bowing down to Baal or Baal. What you get in Deuteronomy is kind of backwards looking and forwards looking. It's backwards looking in that Moses, in the second giving of the law, says, guys, let's review what God did to us when we didn't do what he asked us to do. Let's review what happened when our heart posture wasn't what God expected us to have. Let's review, right? And he just goes down to all of these instances that we just talked about. He just takes them through them and says, you see what happened here? Let's not repeat that, right? And then there's warnings of future wrath. Please know, he is very capable. He is very capable of punishing you. What makes you think that he isn't going to be capable of punishing you in the future if you don't trust him and obey him, right? And then there's even a prediction in the Torah of exile. That is a bit of a ways away, right? So here's the thing. How do you kindle God's wrath? Very quickly. If you want to kindle God's wrath, how might you go about doing it? Well, one is idolatry. Worship something, serve something other than God. That will kindle his wrath. That upsets him. That he has what we call a divine jealousy. And I would say that one of the reasons, among others, as to why he is so bent on us worshiping him alone is because we become like what we worship. And he realizes that if we worship something other than him, it's going to send us on a trajectory that leads in nothing but suffering and death and punishment. In many ways. Be rebellious. And that rebellion can take a lot of forms. The form that it often took, as we saw, is complaining and murmuring and distrust and ungratefulness. And it kindled God's wrath, provoked his wrath every time. And then another one is be presumptuous. You're like, well, what's presumption? I went and looked up I wanted to find just a simple but effective definition of this. Are y'all ready? Failing to observe the limits of what is permitted or appropriate. And basically what it is we presume that God will consider us an exception, right? Or, I don't really maybe feel like this is probably the best course of action, but it's what I want to do, and it's convenient, and I don't really want to go at the hard thing, and so it'll be all right. Nadab and Abihu were very presumptuous, I think, when they offered up their strange fire. And it cost them, right? It cost them. So that's how you can kindle God's wrath. No question about it. I've got a couple other slides that won't take us too long next week. And then what we will do is we are going to think about the conquering of Canaan. And why this is so important is it is, I would say, famous fodder for atheists and skeptics of the Bible. For them, what God did in Canaan was nothing short of genocide. And that if you are worshiping this God, you just need to go ahead and admit that you are worshiping a genocidal God. And what person in their right mind would worship a genocidal God? That's what they claim. That's the way they bend this story. That's what they push. And frankly, it's been pretty effective for a lot of college students. Yeah, why have I been worshiping? Why did I go to church all these years? Look what he did in Joshua. It's terrible. And especially when you consider the fact that I guess I would say, punishing the Canaanites, some innocent people had to die as well. And those innocent people are what we call children. And that really is a sticking point for a lot of people in our world today when they look at that story. All right? So we're going to get off into that, all right, starting next week. So thanks for y'all's attention.
Evening. It's good to see each and every one of you. Got a good crowd tonight. We may yet have some online as well. We welcome all of you. I think you can see what the song will be in just a moment. As per usual, have some prayer requests. I got a sympathy notice, and then a slew of reminders. Joanne Holman is still in STRHS Lawrenceburg, room 174. She is undergoing therapy and is still trying to recover from pneumonia. And we want to keep Joanne in our ongoing prayers. Marion Isabel is scheduled to have surgery tomorrow at Murray Regional to fuse the discs that are causing her ongoing severe lower back pain. She is first on the schedule tomorrow, which she is happy about. And so she has to be there very early in the morning. Toby Sockwell is scheduled for, a couple of doctor's appointments tomorrow. And, there's a possibility that she will be staying at NHC. I think originally she's thinking maybe she could get out by the end of this month, may have to get over there into November. But she does like going out and watching the birds and watching the leaves change, and keeping up pretty good spirits all the same. Our sympathy notice is, again, we want to extend Christian love and sympathy to Angela and Russell Gibbons on the death of Angela's mother, Barbara Smith. The local arrangements are as follows. Visitation will be held from 9 until 10:30 a.m., and a memorial mass will begin at 10:30 a.m. on Friday, October the 31st, at Sacred Heart Catholic Church here in Lawrenceburg. Here are a few reminders. There will be a Lambs activity tomorrow from 3:30 to 4:45 over in the Fellowship Building. The plan is to paint pumpkins that will later be delivered to some of our shut-ins and some of our nursing home assisted living facility residents. So that is the plan tomorrow for the Lambs activity. And then we have about 5 things associated just with this Sunday, okay, October 26th. Lions meet at the church at 3:30 p.m., and this is to participate in that annual pumpkin carving decorating contest. And those pumpkins will be judged during the soup and chili supper later that night, which I will mention yet again in just a moment, okay? Also, it's a fourth Sunday at the Summit that will begin at 4 p.m. I think we've got maybe a couple of families signed up, but if you want to be in on that, it is from 4 to 4:30 at the Summit. I think the Heltons and at least as many of the Evanses in my group are going to be there. But we may can get some more to hang out with those residents and sing some songs and hymns together. Starting at 5:30 p.m. in the auditorium, we will have another lesson in our Fortifying Family series from Lonnie Jones, our guest speaker. After that service, we will have a soup and chili supper in the Fellowship Building. There is a sign-up sheet posted on the bulletin board in the inner foyer. You may sign up to bring crock pots or pots of soup and chili, cheese, sour cream, crackers, Fritos, or anything you feel like belongs, okay? There will also be a sign-up sheet for volunteers to neaten and clean the Fellowship Building and get it back in order that evening. And then after the meal, believe it or not, there's yet more. The trunk or treat. And it will be over here in the east parking lot as it has been the past few years. So that is there's a lot going on this Sunday, but I'm looking forward to every bit of it.
Jacob,
yeah.
You mentioned we're going to need to make sure we stay out of the construction.
Oh yeah. Please stay away from the construction. There is a massive black hole pit that they have dug. If you fall in that, it will not be pretty, okay? Not pretty at all. So just kind of stay away from the construction and everything that's going on over there. We are participating in Lawrence County School System's annual food drive, and we are being asked to bring canned vegetables through the month of October, and there are some containers out front where you can deposit those cans. And then finally, Golden Age Banquet. It is scheduled for Saturday, November the 1st. If you can help with food for the banquet, you're going to want to see Caitlin Romsdale to sign up. If you are not an attendee to the banquet and would like to help in any way, please reach out to either Jennifer Springer or Sandy Adams. All right? So that is in regards to the Golden Age Banquet. Early in our incredible marriage, Britt and I, that was good, wasn't it? Just lit it in there. All right. Britt and I went to the melting pot. And it had been something we liked to do around anniversaries, big occasions. And the food was excellent going down. It's excellent. Started with the cheese fondue. We moved to the meat fondue. And then, you know, like they like to do, you end with the chocolate fondue, right? Later that evening, around midnight, we weren't feeling well, okay? And within about an hour, we had all the proof we needed to deduce that we were suffering from food poisoning. We suspected that we probably did not prepare one of the meats correctly. Maybe we didn't plate it right. Maybe we didn't cook it long enough. I don't know. It may not at all be on the restaurant. It could be completely on us, basically. But I'll just tell you this, unless she went behind my back at some point, we have never gone back to the melting pot. We had this horrible experience, and we're like, not going to do that ever again, you know? So why that story? Well, some folks have had a bad experience with church, and they don't intend on returning to that church because of the bad experience they had. Or they've gone so far as to conclude that all churches are not worth going to in light of the bad experience that I had at this one church. The spectrum of church hurt, which is kind of a tag, a hashtag, and other things that's kind of become popular in various social media outlets. That church hurt can range from a perception that people don't want them there, maybe looking at them in certain ways. It can be nobody talked to them, like nobody said a word to them the whole time that they were there. It can even go over in another extreme where maybe the individual was abused in some way, as we've seen play out, unfortunately, in the news media on several occasions. Perhaps maybe in between some of those extremes, just somebody kind of maybe looking at you wrong and abuse, maybe someone was gossiping about them, or maybe someone admonished them tactlessly and in the process hurt their feelings. In some instances, a church can be so polarized and seemingly unloving that visitors are routinely scared away. Bad experiences in church are nothing new. I want you to imagine just for a moment if you were part of the church that John wrote to in 3 John. And here's what John wrote about a guy named Diotrephes. It says, I've written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us. And not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers, and he also stops those who want to, and he puts them out of the church. Now imagine, right, if you had been one of those wanting to be a part of that church, but some guy named Diotrephes arbitrarily prevented you from becoming a part of that church, you might get upset. And you might vow never to return to that church. Right? You had that bad church experience? I think there's two things worth contemplating, and better yet, two things worth communicating to others when it comes to bad experiences and or quote-unquote church hurt. Okay? Two things. One, churches, like people, need grace too. Because everybody in the church are human beings. And sometimes, unfortunately, you might interact with somebody that's having a bad day, a bad week. Maybe they've had a bad year or a bad decade. I don't know. But churches, like people, need grace too. And then I think something that is also important for us to contemplate and maybe perhaps for us to communicate. And what I mean by this second part is you may very well in your life, and it's possible to happen to you just this past week where you're talking to somebody and they're like, well, I'd like to get back into church, but this happened or this took place and I just don't think I can go back there. Here's something else you might want to say. It's not fair to judge the best of us by the worst of us. I mean, there may be some people in any given church that are spiritually immature. They have not grown to the place where maybe they should have. You're looking at them like, I've been a Christian for 50 years. Oh, I would have had no idea based on how you just treated me, you know? And I get that. I mean, that exists. But it is kind of unfair, right? To interact with just a small segment or a sampling of the church and then conclude that the whole lot of them is poisoned and seriously broken and, you know, not worth being around. Whatever the case may be, here's the interesting thing, and God's very relentless about this in His Word. God still calls people to join their lives with like-minded believers. And while a bad church experience, and depending on the severity of it, it might, let's just be honest, it might sour somebody to a particular church to the point where, yeah, they just can't go back there. Okay, I hear you, all right? But that should not be used as an excuse to give up completely on finding a community of Christians with whom you can worship and whom you can work, and with whom you can work, right? It's one thing to have a bad experience at a church and then you to have maybe some really good reasons not to become involved in that church, but it's a far cry to say, well, because this one church dropped the ball, I'm going to just cut every other church out, right? I'm not going to go anywhere ever again. Scripture won't let you have that. They just won't. And so I'm just saying, it may be that some of the conversations with people, who knows? Do you realize that there are people that had a bad experience maybe at this church or at some other church back in 1974? And it still is what keeps them away. It's still what doesn't allow them to trust. And then let me finish here too. For those of us who are members of Christ Church, we should allow this discussion to remind us of how careful we need to be. Not only must we watch how we conduct ourselves before outsiders, before visitors. Do not, I repeat, do not, right, underestimate the power of just some common sense courtesy, right? What might that look like? Are you ready? You walk in. There is a couple that you haven't seen in this building before. This is their first time to be here. You don't know if they're just visiting today because they live 5 hours from here. You don't know if maybe they've been in this community for 2 years and they're looking for a church home. But what you better not do is go, hey, you're sitting in my seat. Would you please move somewhere else? Because this is my seat. Let me just, hope this isn't newsflash, that's not going to go over well with them. I promise you. They're not going to like that. Right? You got to just use some common sense. We got to think through some of these things and how we're coming out. And here's the other side of this too. On the other side, just watching how we treat people, we also must work hard to maintain a true sense of unity and love among us. It doesn't really take people all that long to discern whether or not the body of people they're among actually love each other, or if they're in the business of just like devouring one another, right? And we want people to know that here you can find a loving, patient environment where you can put down roots and you can grow. We're not saying that's going to be perfect, and we're not saying you're never going to get your feelings hurt or anything like that. We can't make those kinds of promises because we're human after all. But I think it's just important to be reminded of this. And it may be that this evening that you are in a place where you're like, no, I got to be honest, I've kind of gotten a little self-focused, or I haven't really paid as much attention to that. Maybe I've got some changing I need to do. It may be for other reasons, not even connected to this. You need the prayers of this church, that you need forgiveness, and it may be you're ready to become a child of God, that you've been loved on enough by the people here and encouraged enough that you're ready to follow who everyone else here is trying to follow. That's Jesus. And you're ready to become a part of his body, and specifically this body. And we would love that. And if we can help you in any way, come now, we're together, we stand and sing.
Marvelous grace of our loving Lord, grace that exceeds our sin and our guilt, yonder on Calvary's mount outpoured, there where the blood of the Lamb was spilled. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that will pardon and cleanse within. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that is greater than all our sin. Sin and despair like the sea waves cold threaten the soul with infinite loss. Grace that is greater, yes, grace untold, point to the refuge, the mighty cross. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that will pardon and cleanse within. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that is greater than all our sin. Marvelous, infinite, matchless grace, freely bestowed on all who believe,
You that are longing to see his face, will you this moment his grace receive? Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that will pardon and cleanse within. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that is greater than all our sin. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we are so grateful that you show your grace to us, and we pray that we could be more merciful and more gracious to those around us, knowing that that is the way that you will treat us if we do so to others. We ask that you would be with us as we leave this place and help us to be able to have a positive impact for Christ on the ones that we come into contact with. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.